firm of Steptoe and Johnson, and we wanted to talk to you today about Mr. Gülen. We have represented Mr. Gülen for a couple of years. We started representing him in connection with the extradition threats made from Turkey in the beginning of 2014. And in the beginning of the representation, we would observe what we viewed as the absurd allegations that were coming out of Turkey. On one day, Mr. Gülen would be a protege of Osama bin Laden. On the next day, he was a Mossad agent. Day after that, he was sympathetic to ISIS. The day after that, he was a cardinal for the Pope. And, you know, because the allegations were serious and we cared about Mr. Gülen, we obviously took the issue seriously, but we never entertained the real possibility that Turkey was actually going to file a formal extradition request, or heaven knows that the United States would ever grant it. And of course, we were correct. And then, of course, came the coup of a couple weeks ago. And since then, from our perspective, the crazy allegations only increased. We have read concerns from Turkey that Mr. Gülen, this elderly, frail religious leader, is going to flee to another country. We read allegations that he and the CIA were behind the coup. The complexity and the absurdity of the allegations only increased. But the reason we asked you to come this morning, and the reason we wanted to talk to you, is that on top of the absurdity of the allegations, we see official acts by the Turkish government that cause us some concern. We see that 3 ministers have come over from our perspective to try to put the arm on the United States to comply with this extradition request. And then we see Mr. Erdogan himself say words to the effect, and I'm not quoting, I'm paraphrasing, they're asking for documents? Are you kidding? We're friends. We are accusing him of serious crimes. We expect the United States to comply. What we have here is this clash of cultures, this clash of civilization. From the Turkish perspective, from Mr. Erdogan's perspective, this is about power and politics. And to be sure, we understand that politics are a component of extradition, to be sure. And yes, of course, Turkey is a critical country from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy, from ISIS to the Kurds, to Israel, to immigration. Turkey is in the middle of everything, and yes, the world would be so much better if the United States had a harmonious relationship with Turkey. But also, to be sure, extradition is fundamentally a legal process, and we are lawyers, and we deal with evidence, and we deal with due process. And guess what? In extradition proceedings, evidence matters and due process matters. Extradition is a formal process determined first and foremost by treaty, by statute, by regulations promulgated by our Justice Department, and by case law. The reason we asked you to come this morning, we thought it would be useful for your viewers and your readers to hear precisely what this process is about, for us to lay it out, and for us to, after that, compare the evidence in the record to date with the legal requirements, and then come to the conclusion that under no circumstance, based upon the record to date and the applicable rules, does Turkey come anywhere close to getting the extradition they're apparently requesting. And to be sure, we're not doing this because we have any concerns that the United States, our Justice Department and our State Department are ignorant of the rules. We took great comfort in the Wall Street Journal article this morning. We're not surprised. We understand and believe that the people who are making the decisions in the United States government know full well what the rules are, and we have entire confidence in them that they will act appropriately. So what are the rules? There are 3 pieces to the extradition process. First and foremost, the requesting country has to come to the United States and say, we want this person delivered to us, and they have to justify it 3 ways. 1, the crimes charged in the host country have to match crimes under U.S. law. And actually criticizing Mr. Erdogan is not a crime in the United States. So we speculate. What are they going to say? Are they going to say there's a conspiracy abroad among the Hizmet followers to murder people? Well, that would be, murder, of course, is a crime in the United States. But then we sort of get to the second and third requirements. And the second is it cannot be a political, the crime cannot be political in nature. And again, obviously, we know, serious people who know about Turkey know what this is about. This is a political battle at its core. And being in opposition to Mr. Erdogan and his party is obviously political in nature and will not suffice. The third is about evidence. The requesting country has to show probable cause that the person requested committed the crimes charged. Without that, the Justice Department says, go back home, no way, Jose. And I think that is, to the extent A and B are not stumbling blocks, C is a stumbling block. But let's just say the requesting country, Turkey in this instance, gets past the Justice Department. Then they have to go to court. They have to go to court in Pennsylvania, where Mr. Gülen is, and they have to persuade a magistrate that all applicable requirements in the treaty are met and the probable cause standard. And then we're in court. And there's going to be a witness stand, there's going to be a judge, and there are going to be lawyers. And witnesses and evidence will have to be proffered to establish that Mr. Gülen committed specific crimes, not beyond a reasonable doubt, of course it's not a trial, but a probable cause standard, more likely than not. And number three, let's just say the Turks are able to get past those two, then it goes to the State Department. And the State Department has to come to a conclusion that the process in Turkey will be fair to Mr. Gülen. Those are the three requirements. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the evidence to date, and then when we're done with that, we're going to circle back, and we're going to apply that evidence to the legal standards and requirements that Turkey must meet. Permit me first just to offer some personal observations about Mr. Gülen. To me, it has been a privilege to represent him. I've met him. I've spent time in the compound, and I'm sure you've all read about him. And in truth, he is elderly, elegant, dignified, frail. He's an ascetic. He's kind. He's Western in orientation. He's an intellectual. Yes, he's an Islamic scholar. He also sort of understands and has read and appreciates Western intellectual history. When you engage him in the world, you learn that he's utterly committed to education. He's utterly committed to helping poor people. He's pro-democracy. He is pro-women's rights. He is utterly Western. He is a sort of moderate, modern, anti-violence, anti-terror Islamic scholar. Sounds like a really dangerous person, doesn't he? When you leave the compound, your strongest feeling is it is extremely unlikely that this guy is conducting foreign policy or conducting coup-related activities from this compound in the middle of the Pocono Mountains in eastern Pennsylvania. Obviously, anything's possible in the world. A meteorite might hit Steptoe and Johnson today at 11 a.m. I think the chances of Mr. Gülen being responsible for a coup in Turkey and the meteorite hitting Steptoe at 11 are about the same. Now, an interesting, so what about the evidence? What about the relationship between Mr. Gülen and Mr. Erdogan sort of early on pre-coup, pre-2013 when the world changed, as many of you know? And I think there has been some reporting that I'm not sure is entirely accurate, that these guys were bosom buddies throughout the period when Mr. Erdogan was the mayor and then as he rose in power. I don't think that's entirely accurate. I think the difference between the two guys, early on, Mr. Erdogan believed in political Islam. That's not Mr. Gülen's thing. Mr. Gülen believes he is an entirely religious person. But I think Mr. Gülen was taken by Mr. Erdogan the way many were in the West. I believe early on, Mr. Erdogan represented a promising vision for Western people who wanted to see countries in the Middle East emerge into the modern world. And certainly Mr. Erdogan sort of presented that picture early on. And I think if you took a poll of the American foreign policy establishment in the last 10 years and asked who was the biggest disappointment in the entire world, they would say Mr. Erdogan. And I think Mr. Gülen saw signs that there was trouble ahead as Mr. Erdogan became more and more intolerant and more autocratic. But of course, the pivot upon which everything turns in this story is 2013, when prosecutors, some of whom were sympathetic to the Hizmet movement, Hizmet meaning service in Turkey, and yes, in Turkey there are Hizmet, people sympathetic to Hizmet who are teachers, who are judges, who are scholars, who are judges, who are prosecutors and policemen. Yes, of course, that's true. And there were prosecutors who uncovered very, very serious corruption within the Erdogan ranks, even the Erdogan family. And if the press is to be believed, there is a tape in the world of Erdogan himself talking to one of his children about squirreling away millions of dollars. I've not heard the tape myself, but it is reported all over that that, in fact, is true. And that broke the relationship for all time between Mr. Gülen and Mr. Erdogan, because Mr. Erdogan's reaction was to punish and purge those responsible for the allegations against him. And it is a pattern that has repeated itself over and over again. And Mr. Erdogan declared war on Mr. Gülen and the Hizmet movement. Now let's talk about the coup. And obviously, if you're representing Mr. Gülen like we are, you do everything you can to try to figure out what happened 2 weeks ago, what actually happened in Turkey 2 weeks ago. And we claim no special knowledge, no special information, and I'm sure there are people out there who know more than I do. But I guess you would say if we went to Las Vegas and looked at the tote board and said, what's the most likely explanation for what happened, it would be disaffected officers in the military, perhaps Kemalists, perhaps ultranationalists, who saw the handwriting on the wall that they were going to get purged, because Erdogan purges all sorts of groups in addition to Hizmet, and they took action, precipitous action, that obviously was dismal in effect and a disaster overall. I think there are people who think this was completely staged by the government, by Mr. Erdogan. I mean, if he staged it completely, I think that would be sort of extraordinarily creative, but who cares what I think, and who knows if that's the answer. I think what we need to talk about is whether or not there were Hizmet followers who were participants in the coup. And the answer to that is who knows at this point in time, whether or not there were people who were sympathetic to Mr. Gülen's teachings who participated in this. We don't know the answer to that. But I would remind people, I just read a book about World War I and German soldiers who were killed during the fight, and in their book bag or in their backpack, they frequently had Thus Spake Zarathustra by Nietzsche. I don't know if we have any Nietzschean readers or scholars in the room. To be sure, Nietzsche was horrified by nationalism. He was horrified by war, and he would have turned over in his grave had he known that German soldiers were inspired by his writings. I just read the other day about Buddhists in Burma, not Burma, Myanmar now, who are doing horrible things to Muslims in the name of Buddha. The point being, you can have followers of a great teacher who take the teachings and distort them, which comes down to this. Was Mr. Gülen involved in the coup? And for the answer to be yes, he would have had to act inconsistently with everything he has said and done for the last 4 decades. So I think that's the easy one. And if it turns out, and obviously you've all read his words, he condemned this coup the way he condemned every other coup in Turkey. Again, for Mr. Gülen to be involved, he would have to be acting inconsistent with everything he has done in his entire adult life. What is also true is that three things leap out of the factual setting. One is that the first reaction from the government, from Mr. Erdogan, is to either detain or purge tens of thousands of people immediately. And I think the number's up to 70,000. And he did it almost in a minute. I'm exaggerating, but not completely. So what you can conclude, at a minimum, is Mr. Erdogan fully expected this and was prepared to retaliate against his, quote, enemies immediately. At a minimum, the lists were prepared long in advance of this coup. Number two, Mr. Erdogan sort of escaped the resort where he was staying by minutes and then called to the streets in the middle of the night his followers, and voila, they appeared. What conclusions can you come from that? In the middle of the night, Mr. Erdogan, on some electronic method, calls out his followers, and then all of a sudden they're out in force? Again, it sure seems like this thing was pre-cooked. And then number three, Mr. Erdogan has said publicly, it's a gift from God that this happened. Come to your own conclusions. The only one that matters to us, of course, is that Mr. Gülen had not one thing to do with it. And I think it's also illustrative to see what Mr. Erdogan has done since the coup, and he's basically done three things. We talked about the purge that obviously was contemplated long before the coup. And was he just purging people related to the coup? Well, the judges and the police officers and the teachers. And I just read he purged almost 100 soccer referees. Now, I don't know what role the soccer referees had in the coup, but this guy has a pretty big list. Number two, he has generated hatred. The allegations he has made, and we'll talk about the allegations against Mr. Gülen in a second, but the allegations against the United States, that's an oh my goodness. There was a very sobering article in the New York Times, either yesterday or the day before, how polling in Turkey reveals unanimity on only one thing, and that is the United States was behind the coup. I mean, this is our ally, fomenting hatred in Turkey for the United States. And number three, torture. I mean, there are pictures of soldiers who have been detained and brutalized, obviously looking for confessions. And if Amnesty International is to be believed, brutal rape of soldiers to both humiliate and to generate confessions. And obviously, confessions we anticipate will contain allegations that will be easily disproved. And let's talk about what has recently been said about Mr. Gülen. And again, we, in the course of the representation of Mr. Gülen, we sometimes have a competition. Which is the most absurd allegation, the most far-fetched allegation that's been made in Turkey about Mr. Gülen? And it's a serious competition. I think for me, perhaps the lead is that Mr. Gülen was responsible for shooting down the Russian jet. You remember, this would be pre-coup, that a Russian jet was shot down, and it was a major international incident. I mean, Turkey and Russia have a very complicated history, and the last thing anybody wants in that volatile region of the world is a fracas or a conflagration between those two powers. And at the time, Mr. Erdogan, when the plane was shot down, my responsibility, he was very proud of it. No, well, now it's not his responsibility anymore. It's Mr. Gülen in the compound in Saylorsburg, and I can see him before a computer with a joystick, and there's the Russian plane, sort of taking it down from the compound. I'm obviously being facetious, don't mean to be, this is too serious a subject. Let me just think about the absurdity of the allegation that Mr. Gülen in Pennsylvania was responsible for shooting down that plane. Another allegation that Mr. Gülen put a hit on Mr. Erdogan's daughter. Even the Turkish judicial system, after the purges by Mr. Erdogan, found that to be so absurd as to require the newspaper who published it, a pro-Erdogan newspaper, to pay damages. Trucks went into Syria. Mr. Erdogan claimed the trucks contained aid to Turkmen. These are people living in Syria who were sort of caught in that horrible civil war. Well, of course, it turned out that they contained arms. And the allegation, of course, was that the Turks were supplying arms to the Sunni extremists. And the way to deflect blame there, of course, by Mr. Erdogan, is to blame Mr. Gülen. And over again, there have been instances where Mr. Erdogan has said he has gotten assurances, even from President Obama and sometimes Vice President Biden, that have had to have been clarified by the White House, completely contradicting and undercutting the credibility of the words that come out of Mr. Erdogan's mouth. But the big one is the lawsuit that was filed by clearly Erdogan-inspired lawyers in the United States, pre-coup. And this is something I really hope you get your arms around, and my colleague, Mr. Miller, is going to explain it to you in some detail. And just the background to all this, pre-coup, Turkish government hired law firms here to go after Mr. Gülen, clearly to build the case for extradition and or punish Mr. Gülen in some other fashion. And when we consider, which we'll do when Mr. Miller's done, the evidence that the Turkish government may be presenting to our Justice Department as we speak, think about the case that they brought just a couple of months ago. Think about the allegations, the quantity and the quality of the evidence, and what happened when it went to court. So with that intro, Mike.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming today. My name is Mike Miller. I'm a partner at Steptoe in our New York office. Thank you for navigating our space. As you can see, our lobby is a little bit of a work in progress. Reid and I represented Mr. Gülen in connection with a lawsuit that was filed in the Middle District of Pennsylvania in a sleepy town called Scranton, Pennsylvania, which I think of most often in the context of the TV show The Office. And there we go. We found ourselves in Scranton, Pennsylvania, representing Mr. Gülen. The lawsuit alleged, in essence, that back in 2009, Mr. Gülen instructed, directed, requested his followers in Turkey to launch a criminal investigation into members of a religious sect referred to as the Dogan movement, D-O-G-A-N movement. There was, in fact, an investigation and a prosecution of members of the Dogan movement in Turkey. There were, in fact, a number of individuals convicted and incarcerated in Turkey. The allegations at the time is that the Dogan movement was affiliated with, supportive of the interests of Al-Qaeda, and were otherwise involved in illegal activity in Turkey. The question that the lawsuit raised is whether Mr. Gülen had anything at all to do with that. That lawsuit was filed in December of 2015. Reid talks about the steady drumbeat in Turkey of trying to close the world in on people who are self-identify as being Gülen followers. This lawsuit was one of those steps in that direction. Filed in December of 2015. Just 6 weeks earlier than that, in October of 2015, a law firm put out a big press release, the Amsterdam law firm, that it had been retained by the Turkish government, that it had been retained with the express purpose of essentially chasing Mr. Gülen around the globe, 9 states included. If you've been reading at all about inquiries into the charter schools that the Gülen, followers of Fethullah Gülen have started around the country, the Amsterdam law firm has been pushing that agenda since it was retained. 6 weeks after they were retained, 6 weeks after a big splashy press conference to announce that they'd been retained by Turkey, this lawsuit was filed. Just 2 months ago, to jump to the end of the story, a judge sitting in the district court, federal court in Scranton, Pennsylvania, dismissed the lawsuit. And dismissed the lawsuit with a decision that not only found that the lawsuit was unwarranted, but also found that the plaintiffs would not be allowed to file an amended complaint. And that only happens when a court concludes that it would be impossible, futile, for the plaintiffs to actually draft a complaint that would pass legal muster in court. And I'm going to get into the details of that a little bit, but I think the reason that we want to take a little bit of time and talk about this case is this is one of the few times where we've been able to really pull the curtain back and personally look at the quality of evidence that the Turkish government is putting together to try to pursue Mr. Gülen around the world. So bear with me if I go into a little more detail than you're interested in, but I think it tells a very compelling story about how the Erdogan administration views due process, how the Erdogan administration views the means that it is willing to pursue in order to get Mr. Gülen. When the lawsuit was filed, one of Mr. Erdogan's lawyers told the press that the lawsuit, quote, represents a legal battle as well as a political battle and an investigation targeting the Gülen movement. So in detail, the lawsuit was filed by the lawyers who had been retained by the administration in Turkey in December of 2015. Just a moment of legal stuff. The lawsuit was filed using a statute called the Alien Tort Statute. It's about a 200-year-old statute. It's got a really interesting old history. It was a statute that was designed to create jurisdiction in a very narrow category of cases in federal court in the United States. Some of the early examples of that kind of jurisdiction was in connection with piracy. It was in connection with misconduct directed at dignitaries from foreign countries. It was designed to deal with a very narrow category of tortious behavior that could properly be pursued in federal court. Why am I boring you with the history of the Alien Tort Statute? In order to bring a case in the federal courts in the United States under the Alien Tort Statute, plaintiffs have to provide a tremendous amount of detailed, factual support for the position that the defendant in the case, operating in the United States, directly contributed to, participated in the violation of international law that underlies the complaint. In this case, the alleged improper prosecution and incarceration of individuals in Turkey. So in other words, in simple terms, Erdogan's lawyers had a clear mandate to use whatever resources they had, to use whatever access they had to the Turkish government, to use whatever evidence the Turkish government has gathered against Mr. Gülen, and bring their strongest and best case in the United States for why Mr. Gülen is pushing buttons here that have an effect over in Turkey. At the end of the day, the evidence that the Turkish government brought to bear on Mr. Gülen in Pennsylvania was that Mr. Gülen in April of 2009 delivered a sermon, and that allegedly in that sermon in April of 2009, which, and just as a parenthetical, Mr. Gülen does periodically give sermons from his home in Pennsylvania that are then broadcast around the world. No surprise, he does that with some regularity. He's done that over a number of years. The allegation was that one of those sermons, a specific sermon in April of 2009, included instructions, directions to his followers in Turkey: launch an improper criminal investigation, fabricate evidence, improperly arrest, prosecute, convict, and incarcerate individuals in Turkey. Some pretty bold allegations. That is what the complaint alleges Mr. Gülen did. And the complaint alleges that he communicated those instructions by way of this sermon. The lawsuit did not contain a copy of the sermon. The lawsuit did not quote directly from the sermon. The lawsuit didn't even explain where they found a copy of the sermon, April 2009. So we went out and we found a Turkish language version of the sermon, and we had it translated. We were surprised to read the translation, and this is very telling. The sermon contained no instructions to anyone to do anything, improper or otherwise, with respect to the Dogon movement. Dogon movement wasn't even mentioned. There was no mention of police, no mention of prosecutors, no mention of judges, no mention of Al-Qaeda as a rationale for prosecuting individuals associated with the Dogon movement. Fundamentally, no direction to anyone to do anything to anyone improper. This really came as a surprise to us. We figured they must have something in this sermon that they were relying on. In May of 2015, Reid and I ended up in Scranton, and we had an oral argument in front of Judge Mariani in the Middle District. And Judge Mariani, after listening to arguments that we were making on this exact issue, turned to Mr. Erdogan's lawyers and asked, quote, whether there was something in Gülen's speech, some passage or passages which literally or by reasonable inference suggest that Gülen is urging, directing, instructing, instigating that action be taken against members of the Dogon movement, actions such as that which you allege was taken against the plaintiffs. Erdogan's counsel, to his credit, answered honestly, quote, not in plain English and specific language. So you think about it, this whole complaint was predicated on the contents of a sermon that when you actually bothered to pull the sermon and translate it and read it, it said nothing of the sort. As the pressure sort of grew on the Erdogan lawyers to explain their pleading approach, they ultimately explained that, well, what we're really trying to do here is we're using a theory of pleading that we refer to as dog whistle pleading. In other words, allegations that you can't hear, but that person over there can hear. So in other words, if I say green light, what I really mean is red light. If I say love your brother, what I really mean is start an improper criminal investigation. And they literally advanced that argument, backing that up with some 1950s era research on methods of communications out of the old Soviet Union. This is literally the argument that they made. The judge rejected it. We also came up separately with evidence that the investigation into the Dogon movement actually predated the sermon by a good stretch of time. The complaint relied on a police report prepared by a specific police officer in Turkey that post-dated the delivery of the sermon. So the Turkish government has brought a whole bunch of criminal cases over the last bunch of years. And in connection with one of those, last fall, 2015, they produced a police report by the same police officer, predates the sermon by about 5 months. Dogon movement investigation, full throttle. No question about it. There's nothing about the sermon that constituted a direction or an instruction, and as a purely temporal matter, there's no way it launched, caused, set in motion the investigation. I am sure you've heard far more about this one case than you ever thought you would. But let me finish with the holding of the court. 3 quotes. Now, by the way, I should tell you, I believe on each of your chairs you have a copy of the sermon, and we have highlighted some of the key language in the sermon. You'll see, if you go right to the highlights, you will see the kind of language that Mr. Gülen uses when he talks about how people should relate to people. It's just completely inconsistent with the allegations in the complaint. We also gave you a copy of the court's decision. And if you wade through a whole bunch of recitations of the allegations in the complaint and discussion of the law, you're going to find around page 28, 29, and 30 of the decision the following quotes. The court dismissed the case, finding that, first, Mr. Gülen's speech, quote, does not on its face contain instructions to his followers in Turkey to take any specific action against members of the Dogon movement. Second, and this is a somewhat longer quote, the allegations in the complaint offer, quote, only circumstantial and tenuous allegations of connections between Gülen's domestic conduct here in the U.S. and the violations of plaintiffs' rights in Turkey. They are not sufficient to indicate any express understanding between Gülen and his followers that he was issuing instructions to them to engage in acts which would amount to persecution of the members of the Dogon movement. This is particularly true in light of plaintiff's inability to point to any part of defendant Gülen's speech or the 2 television episodes which directly convey instructions by Gülen. There were also allegations that essentially Turkey's version of 24, if you remember Kiefer Sutherland's old show, also had secret messages embedded in them. The court didn't find that persuasive either. Lastly, the court held the complaint does not set forth in specific factual manner the role of Gülen, including his level of control over the Doe's conduct and what specific directions, instructions, or aid, if any, he provided the Doe's. The complaint named Mr. Gülen as a defendant and then about 50 John Doe's, unidentified individuals, presumably in Turkey, presumably the ones who did whatever the complaint alleged happened in Turkey. So in a nutshell, 8 months ago, a lawsuit filed in Pennsylvania. It represented President Erdogan's best shot at establishing that Mr. Gülen here in the U.S. was pushing buttons that had a bad effect over in Turkey. And the reason we've taken so much time to sort of walk through this specific case, giving you the sermon, giving you the decision, is that the parallels between the allegations that are being made now, the allegations that Mr. Gülen had anything to do with the coup, are of the same ilk. I mean, as far as we have seen, we've seen nothing that has been put out in the public eye that supports the view that Mr. Gülen had anything to do with setting the coup in motion. And to the extent that the Department of Justice is signaling at all in conversations with some of the reporters in this room that the likelihood of an extradition has dropped a lot based on the quality of the evidence being presented by Turkey, our only serious deep dive into the quality of evidence that Turkey has against Mr. Gülen fully and completely supports that conclusion. So we're happy to answer questions at the end of this.
We have a little one more point on this very subject. So just following up on what Mike said, let's just try to envision what's going on with the Justice Department and Turkish officials right now. I'm guessing, and it's an educated guess, that our guys, the Justice Department of the United States, is trying to help their counterparts in Turkey. I'm guessing they're treating the Turkish officials with complete respect and they're giving them every benefit of the doubt. And I also am guessing that if the United States had evidence of Mr. Gülen's involvement with the coup or any wrongdoing whatsoever, their instinct would be to share it with the Turks. And I think here's where this comes out. What evidence could be offered to the Justice Department? What is the Justice Department reviewing right now? Perhaps there is a Hizmet sympathizer who participated in the coup and either after being beaten or not is admitting to the Turkish officials that he's sympathetic to Mr. Gülen's teachings. That ain't enough in the United States. That doesn't implicate Mr. Gülen in anything. But what about the real heart and soul of evidence in cases like this? Wiretaps. I would bet a lot of money that there are probably 3 or 4 intelligence agencies that capture every electronic communication that comes out of the compound in Pennsylvania. And I would guess, and it's an educated guess, that 1 or 2 of those intelligence agencies are ours. And I bet if there were communications in the last however many years Mr. Gülen has been there consistent with wrongdoing, we would know about it. And we read in the newspaper that Mr. Clapper, who's the head of our intelligence agency, has said directly, no such evidence. I'm also sure, not sure, but I'm an intelligent guess, if there are people in Turkey who are sympathetic with Hizmet, that Turkish officials, Erdogan guys, are very aggressively capturing electronic communication there too. And we haven't seen any evidence, direct or indirect, that would be persuasive to a fact finder that there is a scintilla of evidence, electronic or otherwise, implicating Mr. Gülen. And these tortured confessions that we're expecting, that won't work in a U.S. court either. It certainly won't work with the Justice Department, but again, think about, let's just say that they get past the initial hurdle at the Justice Department. The Justice Department says, okay, we will allow it to go to court. There will be a very interesting court proceeding in Scranton, Pennsylvania. We will be there. Mr. Gülen will be there. There'll be a judge. There'll be a witness stand. What evidence are they going to offer Are they going to bring some guy who was tortured to take the witness stand and say what? I don't know that they're going to be wiretaps. I mean, are there going to be documents from the compound from Mr. Gülen? Is there going to be a messenger? If so, we haven't seen any of it. So sort of bottom line, evidence matters and due process matters, and they'll never get past hurdle A or hurdle B. And then we get to the final hurdle. Is there any chance in the world that Mr. Gülen would get a fair trial in Turkey if he is extradited? How about those 70,000 people to date who have been detained and or fired? Any due process going on over there as far as anybody's concerned? It would be unprecedented and appalling if the United States took a frail, almost octogenarian, plopped him on a plane to go back into that kind of setting with the hideous things that are being said about him by the entire Turkish government. Bottom line here is that the bluster, the conspiracy theories, and the threats of Mr. Erdogan are not strong enough to overwhelm the American legal system. And for that reason, we believe that Mr. Gülen should not and will not be extradited. Happy to take questions. Yeah.
So what evidence has been presented in the case, in this specific case, and how do you refute it? I mean, is he accused of calling them on the phone, Skyping? How is he accused of physically, like, directly recording?
No idea. I mean, we're dying to know, and we assume, like, this is what we've read from you guys, that there are boxes and boxes of material that have been sent from Turkey to the Justice Department. We're guessing that some of the material is that nonsensical case that we just litigated in Pennsylvania. But, I mean, to date, the Justice Department has not come to us and said, these are the allegations, this is the evidence, respond. And we're hopeful they never do, because we're hopeful that the Justice Department, on its own, comes to the conclusion that it is woefully inadequate, and the case just dies right there. Yes.
Have you reached, you said the Justice Department has come to you. Have you reached out to the Justice Department to start making this case to them early on?
Fair question. And the answer is, as you would expect, in the normal course, we have acted the way lawyers act, and the Justice Department has been apprised in a formal way of our position on these issues.
Did they respond? Did they reply at all to your
The importance is, I mean, we don't know what they have, and we don't know what they're doing right now. So that is the operative answer to the question you just posed. Yeah.
So has the Turkish government formally requested his extradition at this point?
You know, I don't know for sure, and I think we read the press, and I'm guessing they educated guess, but not for sure, that they have requested it informally 1,000 times in their speeches and their conversations with U.S. officials. I'm guessing they have provided the Justice Department with boxes of whatever, but I don't know if they have complied with or even gotten close to the formal requirements under the treaty. Yeah.
How has the post-coup crackdown in Turkey affected Mr. Gülen financially? Have his assets in Turkey been seized? Are his businesses and businesses that he's affiliated with being affected by?
I don't know, and we are his lawyer on the extradition, so I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I do know this. He lives a very modest life. He's an ascetic, and I'm sure sympathizers in the Hizmet movement have been brutalized in Turkey. I mean, I read that every single day, so I'm sure they are suffering mightily. But, you know, in terms of Mr. Gülen personally, and I'm sure he's suffering internally, he's a sensitive man, but his ascetic life has not been affected, that's for sure. Yeah.
So you're not working with these lawyers in Turkey then?
I'm working with his lawyers in Turkey to the extent I need to know what allegations are being made, you know, but only in the context of the extradition. Yeah.
What would you guys anticipate at this point that Turkey is trying to use as their main evidence, and how do you respond to that?
No, I mean, we only talk about that 23 out of every 24 hours. So I'm guessing, you know, I do believe if there was electronic evidence, it would have been surfaced. I don't think there is any, period. I'm guessing if the press is to be accepted and there's a logic to following what this guy does, they're torturing people. They're beating confessions out of people. And, we know how to deal with that. And I think savvy Justice Department officials who are evaluating that evidence know how to deal with it, too. Yeah.
In Turkish press, there's been reports that the people affiliated with the movement who were detained as part of the coup investigation were found with $1 bills on them. And it's been alleged that this is a trademark of Gülen, that he gives out $1 bills to his followers, and that this is being used, at least in the Turkish media, to drum up support for the idea that he was directing the coup. Have you heard anything about this?
No, I mean, first time I'm hearing that is right now, but I'm trying to think like that $1. What will that do? I mean, what's the effect of the $1? Just symbolic?
No, I think there's reports that the serial numbers on the bills were used as ciphers for his followers to decode messages.
Oh my goodness, it's like the dog whistle. Yes.
Are you expecting Mr. Gülen to stay in the retreat
Yes.
center for this entire process, or expect him to move it?
Yes. Expect them to stay, yes.
So in this case is bound to fail. Why is Turkey doing this thing?
I like your opinion on that. I mean, the best I can come to is what I said first. I think there's a collision of cultures here. I think Mr. Erdogan believes if he snaps his fingers, people jump. They say, how high? And, he's sort of run into the American legal system. Yeah.
Do you know any instances in the past in which the United States government has extradited a resident for allegedly plotting a coup in another country?
I'm not an extradition expert, so none immediately come to mind. I know Turkey has requested Hizmet followers before from the United States and other countries and have been turned down. But, obviously a fundamental core of virtually every extradition treaty we have, and we have them with over 100 countries, is there will not be extradition for a political offense. I don't think the Turkish government can make any of A, B, or C, but sort of the political hurdle is huge. Obviously, if the conclusion of the Department of Justice lawyers who respond to the Turks is that this really is about Mr. Erdogan being furious with the Hizmet people because they're in opposition to him, the extradition request is tossed aside. Yes, sir.
What's your interpretation on when, if any time, does it become illegal for someone in the U.S. to so-called conspire against another government? I mean, for many, over the centuries, lots of people have come to the U.S. because they were opposed to other governments.
It's an interesting question. Obviously, we have massive freedom here. We have massive First Amendment freedom, and that is a real hurdle for the country requesting. I mean, we talked about that endlessly too. I mean, I don't know if it would be a conspiracy to commit murder that the Turks will allege, but they really do have to find a crime that is matched in the United States. Yeah.
Under, obviously, Mr. Gülen is still a Turkish citizen and not an American citizen, and there are certainly other ways that the American government could limit his stay.
Of course.
I mean, have there been any signs from the government that they're looking into his immigration status, anything else he might have done that would put his immigration status into question?
Certainly not to date in connection with the Turkish government efforts. Yes. Anything else? Yeah.
What would your response be if the Turks end up presenting an affidavit from some legal officer in Turkey saying, I attest to the following confessions and statements because probable cause is based on a legal affidavit. So if you can't see behind those confessions, what would your response to that sort of presentation?
You asked interesting and difficult questions. I think, we argue, we do everything we possibly could to go behind the affidavit. We would certainly do that with the Justice Department. And then we go to court. And you're absolutely right that hearsay is admissible in an extradition probable cause hearing. We would do our best. I would anticipate that the judge in Pennsylvania would listen to our evidence and we would attempt to refute it either directly or circumstantially. And if we were not successful there, we'd go to the Secretary of State and saying, putting aside the quality and the quantity of evidence that was proffered in court, this guy cannot get a fair trial, and heaven knows he would be put in jeopardy the second he gets on the plane. We do. I mean, you know, we're very concerned about his safety.
Have you got any security from the U.S. government for him?
Not to date.
Have you asked for it?
Not to date.
Are you planning to?
It's under discussion.
Have you changed the security arrangement around him since the coup?
You know, I'm not responsible for that, so I don't know the answer to that. Anything else? Thank you so much for coming.